Joining us today for the Pundits is Betsy Russell of the Idaho Press, Senator Janie Ward-Engelking, House Assistant Majority Leader Jason Monks, Kevin Richard of Idaho Education News, and Nicole Foy of the Idaho Press. So as we're taping this on Friday in the middle of the day, Senator, you just got off the Senate floor where you had a lengthy debate on the voter initiative bill, and that passed by just one vote.
Yes, in fact, I ran down here to make sure I made it in time, but and I was disappointed to see that it passed, but I was glad that the vote was close. I think, you know, this bill is being run as improving rural Idaho input in the initiative system, but actually the reality is when you limit the time, because we used to have 18 months, and if this passes, we will have 180 days.
To collect signatures, to be clear.
To collect signatures, then I think that flies in the face of rural Idaho, because we all know it takes more time to collect signatures in rural Idaho. I grew up in rural Idaho, so it was a good debate, and I'm disappointed because that right to have a citizen-driven initiative is guaranteed by the Constitution, and I think this makes it virtually unattainable for citizens.
Representative Monks, last week, as this hadn't even been voted on in committee, the House Republican caucus sent out a press release saying that your House Republicans support this bill. You haven't even heard it yet in committee. Why do House Republicans want this?
Well, I think one of the reasons that the caucus decided to send out that press release was to kind of, I guess, help the Senate shore up the supports over there. It was not a unanimously supported thing on the House side either, even within the caucus. So you'll see some, just like you did in the Senate. If we hear that bill on the House, I would imagine we're going to have some dissension on the majority caucus as well, and so that will. That'll play out, I guess, if we have those hearings and we have those debates. I would imagine it'll be hotly contested on the House side as well.
You know, in our interview with House Speaker Bedke, we heard him say that you don't count votes in caucus. So how do you know that you do have enough support for this bill to be bold enough to send out a press release before you even get it on your side of the rotunda?
I guess two parts in that question. How do we ever know on our issues? We don't. In fact, with the bill that we had with the enhancements for Medicaid yesterday, we caucused briefly beforehand and just explained this is what's going to happen. And it was, we'll have to see where the caucus is on this, just because we don't know. We don't feel it's appropriate to poll within our caucus meetings, simply because we do have a supermajority there, and we don't, that's not appropriate for us to make those determinations within caucus. So sometimes when questions come up, you know, are we okay to advance with something? We kind of ask generally, is it, you know, if you've got some serious objections to this, please contact us, let us know. And that's how we kind of get our communications back and forth with the body, especially when we've got a supermajority. Otherwise, it just is not really appropriate for us to be, you know, doing straw polls even within those caucus meetings.
However, I think that it's clear that you have a pretty good idea of where your caucus is. And here's an example. Yesterday, prior to that vote in the House, I heard a member of the House walking down the hall right outside the press room at the state capitol, and whoever he was talking to said, "Boy, do you think that'll pass?" And he said, "Oh yeah, probably with about 45 votes." And you know what? That's what it was.
I mean, you're absolutely right. We do what's called counting noses. We all do on any bill. We never do that in caucus, though. You know, it's a one-on-one relationship of, you know, me going to a senator or to a representative and say, "Hey, do you support this or do you not support this? Do you have any concerns?" And then we, you know, do our manual tabulation and we put it down there. That particular vote, I think, surprised some, but didn't surprise others. I had somebody at that lunch break, a member of our caucus came to me and said, "Man, this thing is totally going down." And I said, "I don't know. I think there's more support for it than you think." And so we had that very discussion during that lunch hour. So we do think we know what's going on, but we've been surprised before on a lot of votes. We think we count them, but sometimes it's just not quite there.
Nicole, I wanted to bring you in. As I was listening to the debate, there has been so much discussion about rural Idaho versus urban Idaho. Now, your beat with the Idaho Press is covering Hispanic affairs, and you've seen demographics, especially in rural Idaho, change a little bit. So do you think Latino voters are represented in these conversations about rural Idaho versus urban Idaho?
Yeah, I mean, I was having the same thought when I was listening to this discussion, because very much of the Latino populations, many of the Latino communities in the state are in these heavily rural areas. They're also in very hard to reach, hard to count areas. So if we're talking about something like, getting signatures for initiative, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to reach them. And those demographics are only growing in these rural areas. We're talking about the Magic Valley, East Idaho, Canyon County. I mean, comparatively, these urban areas like Boise, for example, has a very small Latino population. And of course, that's also, those populations, you don't necessarily see them represented in the legislature. 13% of the state are Latinos, and I believe we're less than 1% of the state legislators are Latino. There's only one legislator who's even identified themselves to the Hispanic Commission as Hispanic, and so that's definitely something that there's definitely a disparity in representation.
When we're having these conversations about rural versus urban, do we risk putting these voters in a box? Like, I know what rural Idaho wants, and I know what urban Idaho wants, when really, as we're seeing, it's not quite that simple to define voters in those strict terms.
Well, I would say that we're definitely putting them in boxes. And, my grandchildren go to a very rural school, and so I spend a lot of time in rural Idaho. I grew up in rural Idaho. And what I found is the views in rural Idaho and urban Idaho are very similar. And in this particular case, they all believe in having an input into our government. And in fact, that's guaranteed by the Constitution, and they want to see it stay that way. And this bill makes it more difficult, and I think it limits the people's voice. It does not bring people in. People were really energized to go to the ballot box this last election, and I think it's because they had some skin in the game. They had an initiative on the ballot. So I'm very disappointed to see the bill go through the Senate, but I was pleased that the vote was very close.
You say that rural Idaho wants to be involved in this process. What's the problem then with this bill that forces inclusion of the rural districts? Well,
there were basically three main things. One of them was that it increases the percentage from 6% to 10% of the registered voters, not the voters, but not the people that voted, but the registered voters. Went from 18 districts to 32 out of the 35 districts. And then probably the most problematic part for me is that we currently have 18 months to gather signatures, and this limits that to 180 days. There was also some information required on fiscal impact, which I find kind of ironic that the legislature is demanding that on this initiative, on the initiatives, and we don't even follow those rules on what the fiscal impact is on the bills that we're passing. So that's kind of ironic, but that might be okay, but it also takes time to get that information and to get that from the fiscal people involved.
But to shift gears a little bit, I mean, we talk about how there's this rural-urban divide. I'm struck listening to this and thinking of what we heard Monday afternoon in the Senate Education Committee, and I'm pointing to Senator Ward Engelking because she's on that committee. You had superintendents from, the Nampa School District. You had administrators from the West Ada School District speaking, urging the Senate to slow down on this overhaul of the school funding formula. And then you had Sean Teagues, who's the superintendent in the Nez Perce School District. 140 kids, so a very, very small school district, saying this is a punch in the gut to rural Idaho. It's going to force us to rely all the more on supplemental levies. So that was one case where you had rural interests, urban interests, speaking with one voice saying, slow down. We don't know how this is going to work. It's not ready. And in the end, Senate Education listened. The bill's not going forward.
And that's interesting that you bring that up, because there have been a lot of instances that I've heard from people who are testifying and people who oppose some of the things that are going through the legislature saying they're not feeling heard. We saw this week overwhelming opposition to House Bill 277, the Medicaid expansion bill, and still that passed out of both committee and on the House floor. There's been frustration over the last couple weeks with the way some of these hearings are going, many of them in the Senate, but still in the legislature as a whole. Is that something that ever concerns the House or the Senate, the optics of how you do business?
I think it's something we have to look at. I think, number one, we have to look at the policy. That's the most important thing. And optics, I think, is secondary, but it is important. You know, some decisions we make are not, they're not popular. And you know, we still try to govern the best we can on what we think is the best. And obviously there's differences of opinions on the proper way of governing. But you know, the optics is very important to us. You know, you've seen this year the House, at least caucus has been, majority caucus has been trying to be a little bit more proactive in press releases, which you probably didn't see much at all before. And it's just an attempt to try to help get those messages out. And how they're viewed. But you know, we've got a lady down there at the Capitol. I don't know if I should bring up her name or not. She'd probably be okay with it. But she's been there for about 7-8 years, pushing one of her bills that she wants to be heard on. And I've got a good relationship with her. I talk to her every day. In fact, on my way out, I had to leave the House floor because we were debating, and she was still standing out there with her billboard and everything, and she's there a lot. And we chatted for a few minutes again. And in fact, last week I was on the phone with her until 10:30 at night. Because she had these concerns and she wants to be heard. And that's what she wants. And you know, we've heard from her, but she wants to be in committee and have her bill heard from a debating standpoint, and she hasn't been able to get that yet. And is that concerning? Well, of course it is. You know, we've had, you know, we had groups that were there for the Add the Words that were there for many years before a hearing was ever granted on that. And you know, of course, so it's
and a bill still hasn't been passed, to be clear. There was one hearing several years ago.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I would say that this year, I think there's been more backdoor dealings, less transparency than I've ever seen. And I'm not sure why that is. But I will say, as far as the funding formula, all the stakeholders, along with all the testimony we heard, said, slow down. This isn't ready for prime time yet. And I think one thing that was learned, one lesson that was learned when the Luna laws were passed, is that we do need to listen to the people that are going to have to implement this and the people that are involved. And so I think that's one reason you saw a slowdown on that.
I think that there could not be worse optics than what we're seeing right now with Senate Bill 1159 in the legislature. So
and that's the voter initiative bill,
to be clear. This is the voter initiative bill. It would give Idaho the toughest restrictions in the country of any state that has the initiative or referendum in order to get something on the ballot. And the history of this is interesting in that each time a voter initiative has passed in the last 30 years, the legislature has changed the rules to make it harder to get one on the ballot. So that happened after term limits. It got overturned in federal court. That happened after the Luna laws. It stands now. That's why we have 18 legislative districts. Now Medicaid expansion passed. The legislature wants to require 32 of 35 legislative districts. The outpouring against this bill has been huge from citizens. The only supporters at all of the hearings who have spoken on it or who have sent in letters have been lobbyists for large organizations. And during today's Senate debate, we heard multiple times from senators saying, I haven't heard from a single citizen who supports this bill. And then we heard supporters of the bill saying, I don't vote based on my emails. It's the legislature's responsibility to decide this.
But some of the senators did say that they had people approach them in private or at the grocery store saying, you know what, I do support this bill. I mean, some people said that they did have people quietly contact them.
Senator Rice discussed talking to people at church and so on, and he went specifically into this idea about requiring a fiscal note. And there's a piece of this bill that might not be unpopular at all. Even during the hearings, people from Reclaim Idaho, the people who qualified the Medicaid expansion initiative for the ballot, said when they were asked, yeah, that'd probably be a good idea to include a fiscal note. But that doesn't go to all the other restrictions. It basically will make it nearly impossible to ever qualify another initiative for the ballot. And what this reminds me of is an issue a few years ago that was much less interesting, but it has some commonalities. And that was when the legislature considered an administrative rules constitutional amendment. And what they were trying to do was protect the legislative power at the expense of the other two branches of government, the executive and the judiciary. And the legislature was really fired up about this. And most people weren't. But the legislature is very protective of its power. And I think we're seeing that in this debate. And in this case, instead of the executive and judiciary, the legislature is taking aim at the citizens. And the optics of that are absolutely terrible.
Well, and you can have big moments of optics and maybe smaller moments. And on Wednesday, Senate Education took up a very controversial education bill on sex education and should parents opt into sex ed as opposed to opting out. And the whole hearing felt really rushed. I mean, you had barely an hour to have the hearing because the Senate was due on the floor at 3:15. The hearing started at 2 o'clock. It felt like the sponsor really had to race through her case for the bill, and whether you support the bill or not, I felt like she really had to kind of do a lightning round presentation. Not everybody who showed up and signed up to testify was able to testify. It was to the point where most of the people who had signed up wanted to testify against the bill. The bill got held in committee. So folks who showed up may have gotten the outcome that they wanted at the end of the hearing, but they weren't heard. And I think if that had been flipped around and if it had passed out of committee, there would have been much more of an outcry. And that's an optics issue where if people show up at the State House and don't get an opportunity to speak on an issue, that's a bad look.
Nicole, I'm curious about your perspective because you have a beat that sort of straddles public policy and the community as a whole, whereas I think a lot of the rest of us on this stage get trapped in that legislative state house bubble, right? So it's easy for us to have a certain perspective, but how is the view from outside the State House when it comes to how the legislature is working and whether or not they're listening to people?
Well, I mean, it's of course, it's hard to speak on behalf of what, you know, a large community and a scattered community is thinking. But I mean, one of the hard things, and I understand that, you know, this is something that's always difficult for elected officials to balance, is, you know, how much of the optics come into play when it comes to social media. Unfortunately, you know, for better or for worse, social media is a huge part of how people interact with the political process, largely because you're far more likely to see, you know, a picture of your elected representative or your governor, or your lieutenant governor on, you know, on your social media than you are to see them walking through the State House. And so that's something that is, you know, again, for better or for worse, drives a lot of discussion. I mean, you know, of course, one of the things that has come up recently when it comes to social media is the picture of the lieutenant governor with the 3 percenters. And there was a lot of discussion on social media. The story was born on Facebook before any news organization even touched it. And of course, you know, there's a huge difference often between what was intended and the optics. But the average citizen is only going to be interacting with the optics, with what is represented. And so, of course, while it may be unfortunate, it's something that has to be considered.
I want to dwell on that for a minute because Lieutenant Governor McGeehan has, you know, in the subsequent weeks had responded, saying it was never her intention to show support for white supremacy. The hand signal in question is identical between supporters of the 3% movement and also white supremacists. It's one that was flashed by the shooter in New Zealand who committed the massacre at the 2 mosques. In that time, since then, there's a member of your caucus, Representative John Green, who posed with members of 3% flashing the exact same hand signal. I think at this point you can't claim ignorance with the connotation, at least, and the optics. Has this come up among House Republicans that maybe we need to be a little bit careful with the social media optics and making people feel concerned that some of their elected representatives are flashing these hand signs?
We haven't had any of that discussion that I'm aware of as far as that specific situation. Obviously, most people there know about it. You know, I learned about it on social media myself and say, hey, did you see this picture? And you look at it and you kind of shake your head and you think, you know, with today's social media, you just have to be so careful with anything you do because your intentions are not always portrayed within a simple post. Because frankly, you can take anything and make it look terrible. And arguably, we make those situations much easier when we do stupid things. And I'm not saying anything was done stupid. I'm just saying sometimes you got to think ahead of time as far as how this is going to impact us. And so, you know, when legislators come in new, you know, we are not used to that scrutiny of things we say. You know, you're in a town hall meeting and you say something and it's not maybe the best way of saying it, and you might get a pass because there's nobody there to document it so you know, carefully. At the State House, everything we do there is pretty much, you know, recorded, and so it is something we should all be very careful with. But you know, getting back to your question, you know, have we as a caucus necessarily addressed that? No, but that's probably a good suggestion that we do review, you know, what we're doing here and the optics associated with it, because, you know, frankly, there is you know, that's another aspect of it. You know, if we ignore optics completely, you know, that affects your ability to be able to get anything done, because you may not be back if, you know, you don't pay attention to optics. So again, you know, you have to pay attention to that, but you try not to let that govern whether or not you're for or against a specific policy. And you know, you have to make that you know, compromise, I guess, between the two, and that's a difficult thing.
Well, and there's the chance that it might affect somebody's election. You know, like you said, they might not be back, but there's also the idea that this might make entire groups of people worry that they're not welcome at the State House, especially if they're people of color and somebody is flashing a sign associated with white supremacy.
Yeah, no argument there. I mean, if that's, you know, frankly, for me, I thought that was the okay sign. You know, like, hey, you know, but obviously I'm not tuned into those things, and so for me, you know, I saw somebody showed it to me, and I'm like, okay, you know, what are the guys in the orange suits for, kind of thing. That was my first question, and then I had to be explained to what was with that, and so, you know, sometimes we do things innocently, and I don't know what this situation was. For me, I wouldn't have known any better at the time.
Well, I think it did have some pretty big repercussions. I had parents and constituents emailing saying, and teachers saying they're not going to bring their students to the Capitol, and that's kind of heartbreaking to me. That's the people's home and house, and so, and also because we have Senator Cherie Buckner-Webb, it was very troubling to her and personal, as it should be, and to all of us. And so we did talk about it and found it offensive, and because that's not who we are. That's not what we do at the State House. We're better than that. Idaho has to, and we already sometimes face some negative publicity in Idaho, and we don't need that. We need to rise above that.
I wanted to touch on one more thing before we wrap up. We have about 3.5 minutes left, but public school funding formula. It has been off again, on again throughout the session, and it came up one more time, maybe one more time yesterday, Thursday in the Senate.
Sort of, but briefly, as we were talking about off air. So it's been kind of a bizarre week and kind of a bizarre process between the House and the Senate, and within the House Republican Committee. Briefly, another version of a draft bill came out that would have been more of a definitions bill than an actual bill, but it sounds, Senator, like it may not be going anyplace.
I think that's on hold this year, and probably for good reason. You know, we all want to see a really good new way of funding public schools. We know we have some problems with the current formula, but we need to get it right. We need to make sure that it's going to address all the needs of the state.
You know, we have so many issues that we've really focused on, but I'm curious, what do you think we need to absolutely get done before you adjourn sine die?
I think that funding Medicaid has to be done before we go anywhere. That's the governor's made that very clear that he's not going to let us go, essentially, until that's done. And I think that's the has to get done.
There are still some transportation issues up in the air, as well as the Wayfair tax bill that's on the Senate amending order right now. Are those going to be kind of sleeper issues that keep us here after Medicaid is settled?
There's always those issues that you don't anticipate. I would imagine that there'll be something there. You know, and the idea that we always do things at the last minute, at the 12th hour, is not because we just try to sneak things through. It's because we've been working on it for 3 months. And you know, the school funding formula, that's been worked on for 3 years. And yet we still haven't got a solution for that. And so we're still trying to work on those.
Kevin, I'm curious if you see any issues popping up that have been kind of sleeper bills.
I think right now, I think all of the oxygen in the room is being taken up right now by the Medicaid expansion and the initiative bill as well, obviously. But I think the Medicaid issue is the one that's going to have to be resolved.
Well, and I would just like to say that JFAC has funded Medicaid expansion based on the bill based on the initiative that the people brought forward, and that has been signed by the governor. So we could go home today. It is funded. Hasn't passed the House, the funding bill yet, but it is there, and we do have a bill. So I'm still hoping we get out with a clean expansion.
You two are members of opposite bodies that have competing Medicaid expansion bills. Do you anticipate that that's going to keep us longer as you try to figure out what you agree on?
Obviously, I think obviously, you know, if they pass in the night the bills and they don't come together on some kind of solution there, we will obviously have to work something out. But I think we need to see some of those enhancements put in place before we're able to send that off.
Okay, and that's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you so much to our panel and to our live audience here at Treefort. And thank you for watching. We'll see you right back here next Friday.